we've been getting comments from people who've been traveling, so it's been kind of fun to hear people that are traveling and watching our videos, and it's kind of nice to be able to keep in touch with people over the time. So welcome. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and this is an interesting chapter, all about sex. Oh, shh. It's church. Well, the Corinthians had a few little problems, we know. We talked about the things they were struggling with the temple of Aphrodite being nearby and all. So today, let me see if I can put my notes right here. So we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This, until now, Paul has been answering questions that were brought to him by a group. So a group of people came from Corinth and caught up with him and said, hey, we're having troubles back here. Can you help us with stuff? So, hi, Greg. It's good to see you. Greg Klinkafis is watching this morning. Everybody say hi to Greg.
Hi, Greg.
See, we're all happy to see you, Greg. Where are you, Greg? Tell us where you are. I'll tell them what you put down. So the Corinthians at that church, they were struggling because they had all these questions. And there was a delegation that caught up with Paul and said, Paul, there's these problems going on. And so there were factions and divisions, there were lawsuits among believers, and there was rampant sexual immorality. And so the first thing Paul did in chapters 1 through 6 was address the things that group of people the delegation, they were from Chloe's house, that they brought him questions of. And now in chapter 7, he's going to actually begin answering a question. So Judy Butler's watching this morning. Hi, Judy. It's good to see you. And Greg tells you he's in Nebraska.
Right.
Good to see you guys. So in chapter 7, verse 1, look at the very first phrase. Now for the matters that you wrote about. So the delegation came and they said, these are the problems we're having. But in addition, they brought a letter. And the people had questions. And these were the questions they had. Now let's think for a moment. How are we like or unlike the Corinthians who are asking these questions? Remember the Corinthians, two-port village town with the temple of Aphrodite on the hill. They've been Christians about 3 years. What kinds of things do you think they would have, kinds of questions they would have that would be like ours?
How do I deal with the culture I'm in?
Yeah, especially when worship is all about going and having sex with everybody in town. How does that all work out, right? Now I'm a Christian. Also, if you became a Christian, does that guarantee your spouse became a Christian?
No.
So what happens then? What happens if you used to be a Jew and you became a Christian as compared to maybe you were worshiping in the temple of Aphrodite and you became a Christian? Is there a difference then? You can hear the questions, right? They're going to want to know all these details. Just today, Pastor Vickers was talking about how we can be hypocritical. But can we also be just trying to fake it till we make it? Yeah. There's some truth to that, right? And today he didn't really talk about that balance because he was focused more on this hypocrisy, which is where I'm faking it because I'm trying to cover up the truth from other people. I'm hiding from God or I'm hiding from other people. And that is definitely an issue that we have, right? But we also have the opposite issue where we don't recognize that God has forgiven us and that our sins are in the past. And sometimes we continue to live in lives or in ways that we know are not right. We haven't left them in the past. So this is a tricky thing. And the Corinthians are struggling with all those things. So let's take a look at their questions. Their first question is here. Hi, Julia. The song was beautiful this morning. Really beautiful. It says, now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. Okay, Sarah, that should be in quotes. Because that's another one of those things where he's saying, that's what he said. He said before to them, it's good that a man should not marry. Just like before, remember the phrase he said in verse 12, chapter 6, verse 12, where it's in quotes? Everything is permissible for me. That's what they were quoting that he said, but they weren't finishing it out.
My version says it is good for a man not to touch a woman.
Right.
That's a sexual relationship with a woman.
Yeah, it's more polite to not say sex in the Bible, you know.
I see a butt coming.
Yep.
Yes, exactly. There's a but coming because they're quoting him again out of context. So when he was there, he said, hey, I would just as soon you didn't get married, right? So now somebody said, oh, Paul said commandment number 11 is you shall not marry, right? They right away turn this into laws. Not like us. We don't do that, do we? Do we take behaviors or directions that God has given us and turn them into laws and rules that everyone must follow? How many of you would say it is a sin to smoke? When I was a kid, I was sure everyone was going straight to hell who smoked a cigarette. I was sure of that until I went back to Arkansas and I saw my grandpa smoking a cigarette. And I thought, something must be wrong with this thing because I don't think my grandpa's going to go to hell. I didn't know. I had a childlike knowledge, but I mean, the point is, does the Bible ever say, thou shalt not smoke? We have all... Go ahead,
The
Bob.
only thing actually that goes with that is thou shalt not defile the temple of the Lord.
God is using my body to do his work. From God's point of view, which is worse, overeating or smoking?
Both the same.
Same.
Same, yeah.
Because if the principle that we're based on is that God, I'm yielded to God and he's using me to do his work, then the principle applies to a lot of things. Like I need to be self-controlled in my eating. I should not be smoking. I should not be drinking. There's all kinds of things I should not be doing. And there's all kinds of things I should be doing. Like exercising and, there's all clean, keeping my house neat, clean. Those kinds of things all have to do with living godly lives. But is it because there's commandment number 11 which says thou shalt not?
No.
That's the problem the Corinthians are having. They're trying to put things into rules. Now, why would they have a tendency to want to make these rules?
It's easier to
People
follow
have a lot of
rules.
questions.
Power.
There's a lot of questions, and you want kind of a standard to go by to say, okay, well, what is okay? Because we want to think how we should live our lives. In some way, it's a good thing, but in other ways, it's bad because we take what God created as a relationship and turn it into a finger pointing session.
Which God just loves, doesn't he?
Right.
Doesn't he just love that? How many times have you read in the Old Testament, your offerings are like a stinking, quit giving that stinking smell up to my nose. I don't even want to smell your burnt offerings. Because your heart isn't where you're off making this offering, but your heart isn't there. So he wants us to really be listening and following in our hearts, right? So the problem is, okay, you get married. Do you and Aaron agree on everything? I know, Bob, do you agree with your wife on everything? I thought that was the rule. You were supposed to say yes, yes.
Well, am I supposed to say yes?
I thought that was the rule. No, the thing is that we disagree. So if my husband wants to have a glass of wine with dinner, I don't like him to have a glass of wine with dinner. I don't like that. I don't like alcohol at all. I don't want it near me at my table. I don't want to have anything to do with it. That's my opinion. Is that the law? No, it's just the way I feel about it. I don't like it. So if he has a glass of wine with dinner, that's not a big deal. But that also doesn't mean I have to like it either. So we live with a difference of opinion about something because it's not a law. There are guidelines that we go by, principles we go by. This is not for the baby Christian. What we're going to talk about today is not baby Christian stuff. But it is one of the problems that baby Christians fall into. It's one of the first steps of maturity. It's one of the first times when you as a believer have to step up and say, oh, I get it. I have to make some decisions. Whoa! You have to make decisions. And guess what? Some of your decisions will be right and some will be wrong. But it'll all be about the relationship between you and God and Him guiding you through your life. Yes, Sarah.
And part of your maturity is also recognizing that the other Christians are not where you're at.
Yeah.
They may be further along,
Yeah.
or they may not be as far along in a baby Christian, and you shouldn't project where God has you in your walk onto them.
And honestly, that is my objection to alcohol, that very thing. Because I feel like alcohol has tripped up so many people from early generations. And I feel like I do not want to model that it's an adult thing to drink alcohol. I don't want a child to see me drinking alcohol and say, oh, when I get to be an adult, I'll get to have a beer. I don't want to make that image. So that very thing is the very point to me about modeling. Now, does that make me holier than you?
No.
Well, come on, I was trying to be holier than everybody else. No, we don't earn our way, right? But I feel good about my conviction. I feel good about it. And I'm not critical. I don't say anything if I'm in a group and people are having a drink or a beer. I don't make a big stand about it. But I'm gonna be consistent with what I want to do, you know.
We're supposed to take our own inventory, not
Exactly.
somebody else's.
Very good point.
They're just gonna be, who do they think they are telling me what to do?
Exactly.
We're supposed to, what was that thing about the log in your own eye, you know, instead of splintering somebody else's?
Oh, I've got plenty of logs, right?
Oh, golly.
Alcohol just isn't the one.
It's just-
Now, put ice cream on the table, we'd have to have a talk.
Yeah.
Ice cream's a problem. Alcohol, I can do okay. Let's look at chapter 7. Let's find out what these Corinthians, these evil Corinthians, what they were struggling with. Certainly wouldn't be the same as us. It is good for a man not to marry, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Wait a minute, what are they talking about here? Marital duty? What's that? Sex. So they should be having sex. Now wait. Paul was quoted as saying it's good for a man not to marry. Now in verse 2 he's saying, but there's so much immorality, it's good for you to have your own wife and for your wife to have your own husband. What's he saying there in plain language?
God created you with these urges, but he has a standard.
It would be better for you to be married and having sex with your married husband or wife than falling into sexual immorality and having sex outside of marriage. See what he's saying?
That's 1 Corinthians 7.
1 Corinthians chapter 7, Bob,
I'm on that, I'm not getting the word you said so far.
verse 2.
Huh?
Verse 2,
It's not the same.
it's not the same?
Mm-mm.
1 Corinthians 7.
I got
Verse
my
2.
electrician working on it.
Okay.
First Corinthians.
Yeah.
You were on 2 Corinthians, it looks like. Okay. 1 Corinthians 7, 2. But since there's so much immorality. Okay, so do we have any problem like that? Do we have immorality in our culture?
Oh, my. Yes.
Okay, so we could say that to us. Hey guys, since there's so much immorality, even though it might be better to not be married, to not have that commitment, there's so much immorality, it really would be better to just have a wife, have a husband, and keep your relationship appropriate, right? Appropriate between the husband and wife. Simple.
He designed.
Yeah. What's it say here, verse 3? The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife. Okay, marital duty, meaning the wife wants it, the husband needs to give it. Here's the other way around. And likewise, the wife to her husband. The husband wants it, the wife should give it. Now, do you ever have a problem in your marriage where one withholds from the other? For whatever reason, they're not in the mood, they're too tired,
Got headache.
headache.
Yeah, who's got the aspirin? That's the thing.
We could probably make a list of the
If I
excuses.
say something, she's gonna take it out on me later. You know, I can't sing.
Well, Vern, verse 4 is for you, bub.
Yeah.
The wife's body does not belong to her alone,
So,
but also to her husband. Uh-oh, Vern. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Next words, Vern. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone,
okay.
but also to his wife. Now, we look at that and we go, of course, it's back and forth, wife, husband. But in that day, this is a patriarchal society. This was like, dun, 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 dun. Right?
Yeah.
That not only, because he does the man first, which would be what they would consider normal. But would it be normal to say the wife also has that? in their culture, that would be something quite unusual, especially to the Jews. Julia?
I have an interesting point, which is probably inappropriate, but since I'm here, with my parents and everything, I'll say it.
Oh, nobody listen on Facebook. This is private.
Is that to say that when it comes to your wife's desire for this prayer time, you should be able to control yourself so that she can have that?
Oh, well, if it's a holy thing, then of course.
Are we gonna get really
Fine.
holy now, wife?
You have to find a good holy reason, Julie. Yeah, that's it. See, yeah, there you go. There you go. See, if you can make it holy, then you can.
I was going to ask you if it's appropriate for me to be in this class.
I don't know. By age, maybe. I don't know otherwise. Okay, thank you, Julia. Let's talk more about that. Look at verse 5. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time. What is the gist of this? What is the attitude here? Because like we said, you can't say there's no this, no that. It's not about law. Paul is describing to us what God wants. He's giving us the gist because we're going to have to make our own decisions. And depending on what the circumstance is and who we're with and what's going on, we're going to have to be setting our own boundaries and limitations. And so since we have to do that, he's giving us the idea. So Julia, what you just said then I think fits with this part, don't you think? Because it's saying, do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift and another has that. There are many scholars who believe that Paul at one time was married. In fact, they think that he's probably a widower, and they think that which in that time was very common or not uncommon for women to die in childbirth. And many scholars believe that Paul was a widower whose wife died with their child in childbirth. And one of the reasons they think that is because of his career choice and the studying that he was doing among the Jews. And you could not be in that capacity and be unmarried and not have a family. The only exception would have been something like that, where he had been married, where maybe they had difficulty conceiving or whatever, but when she did conceive, if she died in childbirth, something like that would be what would have been an exception kind of thing. So some people believe that that's where Paul is coming from, but we have no real evidence of that. One of the common sayings among commentators is they look forward to finding out what Paul's life experience was like. But we know that he went back to his homeland even after he became saved. He went back to his hometown, was it for several years? So you don't know what's going on with there. Did he go back to his family then, or we don't really know anything about his family. So it's curious to know. But this is giving us a concept. What is the concept in verses 1 through 7 that we could apply to our everyday married and unmarried lives? What would be the concept here?
I would think I'm reminded of Jesus' second command. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So if, between a husband and wife, if you're considerate of the other person, as you would want them to be considerate to you.
Mm-hmm. So would it be okay to say, well, hurry up, get it over with?
That's romantic. If you agree to it.
Do what you need to do.
I pick the kids up at 6. But that's mutual consent.
You mutually together, you have to, this is something that in a married relationship you would have to talk about, right? You'd have to be willing to talk about this kind of thing, and you'd have to be willing to yield. So as a wife, I would need to be willing to yield. My husband needs to be willing to yield. We're all different. We all have different gifts. But once we're married, we're committed to one another, and our body is not our own. We share it now with someone. And so there's that mutual consent piece that's there. It's a different way of living than in the world.
Don't hold that over my head.
Yeah,
It goes both ways.
it goes both ways.
And it doesn't allow for the selfishness, because it says specifically you're to look to your husband's needs, he's to look to the wife's needs.
Right. So if you always have a headache, you need to do something about that. You know, if you don't enjoy sex anymore, you need to do something about that. You need to figure out what to do about that. And there are, just so you know, there are a lot of people who do Christian counseling in this very area with married couples and with women. If you need help with that, you should ask. There are people who can help you with that. And it gets down to talking about things that none of us feel comfortable talking about out in the open public, but are true for all of us. All of us.
I can hear this now at home. Remember what Laura said?
Well, it's not me. It's right here. Vern?
But I think the overall need that it's addressing is take care of it inside the relationship, so you're not spreading it around the community and doing with everybody, because you're
It's
mutually
not
exclusive.
allowing a foothold for temptation.
Yeah, it's an exclusive.
Your needs are being met where they need to be met
Yeah,
instead.
that was the last point he made. It was a concession, not a command. So it's not something that is, the end all be all.
The truth is that if we were being unselfish and loving in our marital relationship, we wouldn't have this problem.
Right.
But we all get selfish. We all get how we get. And we start demanding that things go our way, whether it's no or yes, whichever way it is, that's our way. And we begin to usurp ourselves and our needs over the other person. Right? That's what happens.
And they push back.
We become selfish, they push back, they become selfish, and we're married. Or maybe not for long, right? This can be a real source of conflict in a marriage. Sarah?
The thing I like about this too is this was written so long ago, but science supports it. When we taught the youth, when we do the sex thing, one of the studies was every young man's battle, every young woman's battle. But it talked about physically how after 3 days, a man, just because of what's going on, starts thinking more and more and more about sex and everything. So if you're not taking care of your husband, well, everything's going to catch his eye. If you're in Corinth, where they have the sex temples.
Trade, yeah.
So I think that's kind of what he was saying right there, even though they didn't have all the science behind it.
Well, and don't you think that after they became Christians, they still had temptations and struggles?
Yeah.
With behaviors that they had in the past or that they see others having, they're still living in that place. We have a few comments here. Judy says, be willing and cheerful in your dealings with all others. So that's interesting. Be willing and cheerful in your dealings with all others. That's the principle. That's true. Sometimes in a marriage we quit being that way, don't we?
Yeah.
Sometimes we're not even polite. We don't smile. We frown. We have our serious face on, right? A lot of times, I've been married a lot of years, 36 years, I think, something like that. I don't always smile at David. For other people, I smile. That alone, that makes a big difference in a relationship. So look at verse 8. Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it's good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
Okay.
That's his feeling about it. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Now notice this is something that Jesus talked about during the time that Paul heard him. It says, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. Now, why would that be happening? Why would divorce be a problem among Christians?
The girls from the temple are they're retiring.
A new wife comes available.
Right, that's exactly right. Also, these people just became Christians. So the wife became a Christian, or the husband became a Christian, and the other one's not, and so they're like starting over. Well, I'll go get a new one and start over with someone who's a Christian. You know, I'm going to this good Bible study. There's a really nice guy there, and he's godly, and this person's, you know, still going to Aphrodite, right? You're living in that mixed culture. Look at verse 12. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. In other words, Paul's saying this is what he's adding. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now, it's not saying that they're automatically going to heaven because they're in your house. It's saying that because of their relationship with you, they come to know God. They come to be believers. They get sanctified. They become forgiven because they come to a knowledge of Christ. He addresses here, but if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. In other words, if you're married and your spouse is not a believer and he says, I've had enough of this. This is not the, I don't want any part of this. And he leaves. He's saying, let him do it. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. Now, who's saying this? Paul. He's trying to give them some judgment about how to judge this. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So in other words, don't give up on them. Don't be the one who gives up. As the Christian, don't be the one who leaves. Because if you can stay in that relationship and have an influence, then all the better. Don't bail on them. Try to stay with it and work with them. Of course, they may bail on you. Of course, this is not saying then that you should try to make them mad enough that they leave you, so then you have an excuse. Vern, that's what not I was saying. Verse 17, nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. What? How's that going to happen? You got little caps or something? Uncircumcised. This is not talking about physical, is it?
No.
What does that mean? What did circumcision mean?
Belonging to God.
Under the Jewish covenant, right? So he's saying that you don't just stop being a Jew. There's nothing wrong with being Jewish and all those things that make you feel Jewish, except that you're not under the law any longer. But you don't have to become some different thing, some different culture. You don't have to start wearing your hair up in a bun because you became a Christian. You like to wear your hair down long. Someone else, anybody have a bun? Oh, Levon has short hair. So you don't have to change who you are because you became a Christian in that way. Let's listen to why. Was a man uncircumcised when he's called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each one should remain in the situation which he was in when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do it. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a freeman when he was called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each man, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation God called him to. In other words, whoever you are, whatever kind of person you are, whatever your struggles are, the things that you work on, those things are what God has called you to. He called you just like that. Let's take Moses, for example. Great guy, huh? What was not so great about Moses?
His speech.
Speech? How about the fact that he was a murderer?
Well, that too.
That little thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that little thing where he had to run out to the desert for I don't know how many years he was out there. And when God called him, he said, I don't have good speech. I'm not good at talking in public. Right? Did God use Moses? He did. And the time he spent in the desert, the time that he was sent away, became a preparation for that, didn't it? For what he was going to do in the future. So where has God called you from or to? Isn't it almost like it's the same way that God calls you from, he's actually calling you to? Who would be the best witness to the people in the temple Aphrodite? Those that have worked there. So of course you're not going to be going to the temple Aphrodite anymore, because that would not, you can see that's not going to be a part of God's plan, right? But would you maybe still have lunch with one of the girls that you knew? And maybe you'd talk with her about what you had found and learned and try to testify to her? What would be the problem with that, though? Vern, what would be the problem?
You might get sucked back in.
Sucked back in.
Yeah, you have to be mature enough in your faith to handle that situation.
But you're right. I can talk to somebody who has a drinking problem because I've had one and come out the other side. You know, I know the way out, and I can show somebody else the way out if they're willing to listen and do the same thing. And it works because I speak the same language and I've been in the same place.
Even just seeing someone who survived it is helpful. So I had a couple of experiences that were pretty bad, and I had people who would come to me that I never knew anything about, and they would come alongside me and say, I want you to know I experienced that, this and this happened to me. I just want you to know that it's going to be okay. It'll work itself through. And that was a lot of help. They didn't offer me any great advice. They just let me know that they had experienced that and they were on the other side of it. A lot of us are struggling with the same things. Well, there was a time that I was a young mother with 3 kids, and some of my kids were brats. You know, and some days they were nice, and some days they were brats. You know, and I wasn't always the best mother. I know that's shocking, but well, I mean, we all have had certain life experiences that we share. And so sometimes when we open up to one another, we can at least provide that encouragement that it's going to be all right. You're going to get through this time and it will get better. And that's something we can do for each other. When God calls you to be a Christian, he calls you right where you are. And his goal is for you to testify to those people right around you. You only have that one moment. You know, once you get past a few years past that place, then it's like you don't really have the same connection with them. But there's a time when you really have a good connection, a good voice, you can speak with them. And so you take advantage of that time that you have without getting sucked back in.
Yeah.
That's the trick. So verse 25. Now about virgins. So guess what else they asked about? That was the section on marriage. So now they're asking about virgins. Now what do you mean virgins? Like people go around saying, hey, what about virgins? I mean, people talk about sex. I don't know if they really go talking around about virgins. In that time, the word for virgin was also young girl. If you were a young girl, an unmarried girl, you were a virgin. If you were, they would decide who was going to marry who, and then you'd be engaged for many years sometimes since you were a child, but usually in the later years they would be betrothed and you would know who you were going to marry. And that girl who you're not married to, a young girl, but she would be called the virgin. So she is not associated with you, you're not living with her, but she's the virgin to whom you are going to get married. And that's what happened with Mary and Joseph. When Mary became pregnant, she was a virgin betrothed to Joseph. And so Joseph could have had her stoned or put away. And so that's where that all comes from. So take a look. So they're saying, well, what about virgins? I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So he's going to give us his opinion, Paul's opinion. Because of the present crisis. Just a minute. What's the present crisis? What's their present crisis? Sexual immorality rampant. New baby Christians. They've got people bringing lawsuits against one another. They have factions and divisions. So they're really kind of struggling, right? So Paul says, because of the present problems that you're having, he says this, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. What does that mean? Are you married? Don't seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Don't look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. Isn't it true? I don't know, maybe it wasn't true for you. But I remember before I met David and before I got married, I thought the end of the world was going to come when I got married. That was the thing. Get married someday. Woo! Then it was get a job. Someday I'll have a job. Right? Then it was get a degree or have kids, or right? We tend to put our hope and our trust in the things of this world, and we measure our success by what's happening in this world. And Paul is saying this world in its present form is passing away. Now, because of the present crisis, don't be just saying, oh, I'm a Christian, now I'm going to divorce and get a new family and start all over, right? Or on the other hand, don't say, I'm going to marry this Christian woman because now I'm a Christian. He's saying, things are a little too unsettled. This world is passing away. Don't put your trust in those things. Build the things that are inside. Look at verse 32. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. So Julia mentioned, what about when your husband wants to do it and you're having your prayer time? That's exactly what Paul is saying. He's saying that when you get married, when you have kids, when you do all these things that are part of being involved in the world, you then have divided loyalties. You have people that you're taking care of. Julia can't say, you kids are just not going to be able to eat today because I'm going to be fasting and in prayer today. Right? She can't say, no, husband, you can never have sex because I like to read my Bible when you want to have sex.
Well, all she'd have to do is wait 2 minutes and then... It's a joke. I'm sorry.
The point is that our loyalties
I opened the door.
our loyalties are divided whenever, and that's true. Now that's not bad. Notice Paul said, don't say, he says this and he's thinking, okay, so I'll just get rid of my family, I'll just blah, blah, blah. He's saying, no, don't change the situation you're in. Work with the situation and use it for the glory of God. But if you have a choice to not be involved in that, don't, because it'll save you that much difficulty. But I don't know if I could have ever done that. I think I was too interested in the things of this world. Getting married, having a family, all that kind of stuff.
Well, and I think things are different because we're kind of a settled country. Think about it in the Middle East right now. If you're a Christian there and you're married, you're thinking, how do I protect myself? How do I protect my wife and my family? If you're single, the persecution is you, not your whole family.
Yeah, it's a crisis situation there in Corinth. Look at verse 36. If anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if she is getting along in years and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. You get it? So somebody's saying, oh, well, I'm sorry, I know that we're betrothed, but, you know, this Paul says we should wait, and it's not really a good time, and it's kind of a critical time now. Meanwhile, she's getting older. She's betrothed to him, so time's ticking away. Do you see? And so Paul is saying, do what you want. If you want to marry her, marry her. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does even better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So Paul, if you were going to put Paul's saying as a principle by which we can make decisions in our lives, what would you say?
Be devoted to God above all else, and whatever situation you're in, try to live in a way that honors God, and it's
Use
about
it.
a relationship.
You're using it. Yeah. You're using it. So you're going to use the situation you're in for God's purposes. Yes. That would be a really good principle to think of it, right?
Yeah.
What about this thing where it says what's this deal about if the husband dies, she's free to marry, but he must belong to the Lord.
Well, there's some other places, don't be unequally yoked.
What's that principle about?
Well, if you know Christ and you get married to someone who doesn't, it does create a burden for you in some way, because you have that struggle that he already discussed, where you're trying to be an example of Christ to them, but in the end they might choose to not do that, and you're either going to live with that as you should, or your spouse might decide to leave you over it.
So Paul's
And you
just
have
giving
to be
you,
okay
it gives
with that.
very practical instruction, saying don't be unequally yoked. Don't, if you are unmarried and you want to get married, at least marry someone who has the same commitment. That makes sense, doesn't it?
We don't need extra stumbling blocks.
No.
For sure.
Now, what about friends? Are they the same way? Just friends? Should I only be Sarah's friend if she's a Christian?
No, but
There's definitely a barrier.
The level of friendship. is what
Yeah.
you have to be careful with.
Or
'Cause
should you go seek advice from your unchristian friends?
Yeah, sometimes they can be pretty wise, but they might be worldly wise, right? It's tricky, isn't it?
It's not that you can't be friends with them, but I
Right.
feel like you have certain things that you have to realize when you're in that relationship, that it might not be godly advice if that's what you.
So even among friendships, we can be unequally yoked, and we have to be careful about that, right?
Yeah,
careful.
but
Yeah, go ahead, say it, Eve.
I'm not,
You're shining the
I'm
light,
not a
right?
good Christian if I'm not witnessing to someone who isn't.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I think that's exactly what Paul is saying here.
Okay.
Is there's a balance here. You want to have those relationships. He says don't divorce the husband that you know. Same thing with a friendship. You're not going to quit being a slave or quit whatever. You're not going to change your
And
life.
then move to an only Christian neighborhood.
Right. Join a commune. Right. For the hope that you will have an influence or a testimony to those that you have a connection with. Bob is involved with the bikers gang kind of people, right? And by being in those kinds of places, he can be a witness or a testimony to a group that with no other way may ever have Christ in their midst. Go ahead, Bob.
When Jerry and I got married, her father came to me, and the way he approached me, we had a stumbling block there. He asked me, he says, being you're Catholic and Jerry is Baptist, what are you going to do with the children? And I told him, I says, the job that I am in, I'll put him in, I'll let the kids be raised in Jerry's religion, because someday I may not show up after I go to work.
That's a good point. That happens often when you have people of two different religious beliefs or practices. Now, between a Baptist and a Catholic, you're still...
That's not different religions.
Baptist and Catholic have certain key differences.
Right.
But you're still talking about Christian faiths. But you could have two that were not so close.
Yeah.
But even if they are close, Baptist and Catholic have certain practices, certain things they expect for you to do within their churches, and it becomes a marital conflict.
It was, for us, a problem for many, many years. Because he was Catholic and I was Baptist. It was a big stumbling for him.
Only with my family. My family didn't agree with it because you could
Right.
say they were staunch Catholics.
Yeah, why aren't the kids in catechism or all that?
And
You
when
have
we
all
got
those.
married, they didn't even come to our wedding because they were so staunch Catholics.
Right.
They thought it was a sin.
Yes,
I know.
yes, they wouldn't enter the church.
So it
It is a stumbling.
It is a stumbling block. So then the question is, when you are you going to enter into that? And Paul would say, what would Paul say?
With one of my daughters, my youngest daughter, it broke their marriage up because he was a Mormon and she was not. And so she fought that battle for many years.
So what would Paul say?
I don't know.
If you're married, stay married unless they leave you, right?
If you're not married,
If you're not married, then that's good.
that's fine. Don't.
Stay that way.
Yeah. Whichever way, you're going to be a witness for Christ. And Paul is saying, think about your new job on this earth, which is to be a witness to Christ. When did Paul, Peter, the other apostles, when did they think Christ was going to come? Like in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Like after church today. They thought he was coming back at any time. Had he come back in their time? They saw him. They saw him rise from the dead and come back. They saw him. So when he said, I'll be returning, but I don't know the time. They lived and felt like it could be tomorrow, next day, today, after lunch. Do we live that way? 2,000 years later? We have a hard time really believing that Christ could be here at this moment. We have a hard time really believing that we could step out and see him coming in the clouds.
We have a problem about believing when he's thinking that we know when he's going to come. But I don't think a real good Christian, I don't know how to put this. It's not the time. I know he's coming. So I've got to live every day up to that point.
Yes.
But if I was one that said, well, he's going to come tomorrow, so I'm going to go out and have a blast.
Well, what do you think Paul's advice? How do you think Paul's advice would be different if he knew it would be 2,000 years later? Because he's like saying, in this crisis time, don't make a rash change. Or do you think he would have made a little different?
Could it be different? Because if it's coming any time, could his advice
I don't
have
think
been
the
different?
advice could be different either because it isn't untrue no matter what time Christ is coming. This advice is sound whether you're waiting a long time or a short time because it's a way of life that honors God.
And the way he
presents
presents
you and your life, it's about Christ and furthering his kingdom.
And the way all the apostles approached their teaching was that it was going to be today. And what they didn't, I don't think they understood, is that 2,000 years later, we continue to have to think the same way. Because Christ is going to come, or you're going to die. In case you didn't know it, all of us...
I don't think they thought about 2,000 years.
No, I don't think they did either. I think they thought it was going to be right now. And I think that served us well. Because when they write, the things they write are... we need to be living every day like this is our last moment. Because we all are going to have a last moment, and none of us knows when it is. And so when that last moment comes, that's what it is. So we need to be living every day as if this were the last day. Every moment as if this were the last moment.
Well, the thing is, we shouldn't be living that way just because we know Jesus is going to come. Because you may die of a heart attack. So you got to live that way every day, no matter what.
Every day, no matter what. That's right. So next week we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians chapter 8, food sacrifice to idols, another question. Okay? Thank you, guys. We have Cynthia Demint is watching too. Hi, Cynthia. Good to see you. Okay, see you guys next week.